started with one cellar. They carved it right into the side of the hill here. That was the original cellar, and then they kind of did an underground tunnel system leading to the other ones, and we'll get to go through those in a little while. But what happened in 1860 was a local businessman by the name of Charles Champlin. He got 12 of his buddies together. They were all local guys from the area, businessmen. They raised $10,000 in capital, and that's how they started the winery. Now, these guys were more so businessmen and not so much grape growers and winemakers, so what they did, they hired two brothers from France, Jules and Joseph Maison, who came across from France from the noted Maison family, and they became our winemakers when we first started. There's a little bit of discrepancy between the Pleasant Valley Wine Company name and the Great Western name. The story behind that is that in 1865 we started producing champagnes. In 1871 we sent one of those champagnes to Boston, where a famous champagne connoisseur then proclaimed that our champagne was the great champagne of the Western world, which is where we got the nickname Great Western. The Pleasant Valley name kind of took a back seat from that point on, and we pretty much became known as the Great Western Winery from 1871 on. Now, in 1880, Taylor Wine moved in right next door over there in those buildings over there, and for about 80 years these two wineries lived here as neighbors, completely separate wineries, peaceful competition and everything like that. Got to be 1961, the Champlin family had kept the ownership of the winery in the family for the duration of it. They had one person to pass it along to in the family who was able to take over the winery, but he decided he wanted to go into the church, so he didn't want anything to do with the winery, so they couldn't pass it along to him. They had to sell. They sold to Taylor Wine. The Taylor Wine bought Pleasant Valley Great Western in 1961, and it was a smart and easy decision for Taylor's. They consolidated everything right here. All these buildings were already used for wine production and things like that, so it was a very smart and easy decision for Taylor's. The Taylor family held it for a few years. We grew to be very large during that time as well. We purchased the Gold Seal Winery, which was down the Westlake Road as well at that time, so all three of those wineries were all encompassed here. Grew to be very large, had a lot of production, a lot of notoriety as well. We were a very profitable winery. We got a lot of corporate interest during that time as well. Eventually, in 1977, the Taylor family sold to Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola came in and bought us out. Unfortunately, they were not too skilled in the wine industry, so they only held us for a couple of years. Through the 80s, we were owned by Seagram's in the early 80s, and then in the late 80s, we were owned by a group of investors called Vintners International. And what eventually happened was, in 1991, Constellation's brand, or Canandaigua Wine Company, they came in and they bought the labels and the rights to the Taylor wines, the Gold Seal wines, and the Great Western champagnes. And they moved everything out of here to their own facilities. When they did that, they bought the Great Western label separate from Pleasant Valley Wine Company, even though it was just a nickname that we had gotten. It was the more recognizable name, worth more money. So they bought Great Western, but they didn't buy Pleasant Valley Wine Company name. In 1995, our owner was able to restart the winery under Pleasant Valley Wine Company because these buildings were dormant and that name had not been bought out with the other ones. So that's kind of where we are today. Now, as we walked into the cellar, you can feel it was a little bit cooler. That's because the cellar was dug right into the side of the hillside here, so it is naturally cooled and regulated on its own. It's underground, so it's like a basement kind of. You don't have to do any air conditioning or anything like that. It saves on cost, which is nice. But the cellar that we're in, this is called the 1871 long cellar. The barrels here, these are called casks. They're wine barrels. They're built by coopers who are woodworkers, but they also build barrels, so they're called coopers. These barrels are all made out of white oak, so that's going to give the wine a certain flavor when it's being aged in the barrels as well. And you can also see the capacity on the front of the barrel in gallons, and then it also has a plate on the front of the barrel as well. The plate holds a tag. Some of them still have the tag. If it was a red tag, that meant it was holding a red wine. White tag meant it was holding a white wine, and that's how you would distinguish between the two there. Now, none of these barrels are being used anymore. The last time any of these were used was 1991. We don't have a need for these anymore. We do all our current holding up in the process center with much larger barrels today, and we'll go see those later. But if we did want to put these into use, we could. We would just have to fill them with water, let the wood swell and expand back out, and fill all the cracks and the leaks in the barrel. So this one's not being used anymore. The wine lab we use today is down behind the visitor center, where the bottling and production happens all down there, so it makes a little more sense for the winemaker to be down there a little bit closer to the action, where she can be more involved in that sort of process and things like that. This next building we're going to go into is this yellow one here. If you want to step to the right, you can see how far it goes back, so you can use that for reference when we go inside. But this is our current process center today. This building was built when Coca-Cola took over, or when the Taylor took over, I guess, so not till the 60s. Capacity in these barrels, and in the facility, I guess. But these two barrels right here, these are in use right now. These are holding sherry in the last step of our Solera process, and I'll explain that in a little while. But you know they're in use because the bands here are tight around the outside of the barrel. If you look at this barrel over here in the corner, all the bands are hanging down loose. That's how you know it's not being used. When they take the wine out, the wood's not going to be as swelled, so it's going to shrink a little bit, and the bands are just going to fall to the sides. And the opposite happens when they fill it up. They have to go rung by rung from the bottom to the top just to make sure it's held this. And from here, a person can control wine moving from anywhere in the facility to anywhere they want, from barrel to barrel. They can clean out all the barrels. Now, our press building is down across the road by the visitor center. So after the grapes are pressed, the juice is going to travel up across the road in pipes up to here to be held and aged. And then bottling happens down there as well, so it has to go all the way back down to be bottled. So the juice does a lot of traveling before it's a finished product. With that, you can see all the stainless steel pipes. If you were to put them end on end, it actually equals 23 miles. So that gives you an idea of all the piping and everything you see running through the facility. And as you can see as well, we have very large facilities. These facilities were built here. This bell was actually the original bell that was used here in the winery in 1860. What it was used for, most of the people at the winery during 1860 in the early days, the people that worked here lived pretty much within a walking distance to the winery. It was kind of like a compound. They weren't making a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of transportation and things like that, so they would really just ring the bell in the morning. Everyone would walk on to work, and then they'd ring it at the end of the day and let everyone know when it was time to go home. So that's what that was used for.
The work bell.
Here, this is a working sherry vault. All these barrels here are holding cream sherry actually in the first step of the Solera process, and I'll explain that in just a sec. But cellar's carved 100 feet back into the earth, so it's naturally cooled and regulated on its own. We don't have to do any air conditioning again. It stays at a nice temperature. The barrels here are all made out of Spanish oak, so that's going to give them a flavor, or the wine a flavor when it's being aged in these barrels as well. These barrels are never going to leave this room as well once they're put in here. To get the wine out, they'll just attach hoses to that main pipe there, and then they'll pump it out from each barrel. Too much of a process to have to move all the barrels and things like that. Now, these barrels are small, and we don't really clean out the inside of these barrels or anything either, so after about 5 years, they're going to need to be replaced. They start leaking and things like that, so they're only going to last for about 5 years, and after that, we'll replace them and get new ones for the cellar. Under the reign of King Charles I in England, so it's real old. It was used in a church to hold linens and wines and things like that. It's carved out of solid walnut, and it does come in two pieces. The top and the bottom are separate, so it might be a little bit easier to transport than you would think, but still very large and very bulky. Came to America when a New York City collector brought it from England. During the Great Depression, he lost a lot of money, had to move upstate, so he moved to Penn Yan and brought this with him. This room is the original wine cellar here. It was not a tasting room originally. They moved this and changed it to a tasting room sometime after World War II. So this was brought in as decoration sometime after then, and it's been here ever since. But I do like to point out the lock to people as well, because it is so old and it's fully intact. It's all original and everything there, so it's just a very unique piece of furniture here as well. Definitely knew what they were doing with the wood. But this room in here, this is the VIP room in here, is what they call it now. It's not used for too much. It's just the original entranceway here. Our owner uses it for his business meetings and lunches and things like that. So that's what it's used for in here. And other than that, we just come through here with the tours, obviously. Now, the chandelier is unique because this was actually from a mansion on Delaware Avenue in Buffalo. It started off as a candelabra, and then it switched to gas and then to electric, so it's kind of changed through the times as well. I guess when someone for the Taylor Winery decorated with it in 1960 something, and I guess he paid $600, and they had an absolute fit about that because that was too much, I guess. But it's been here ever since.